It's good day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millsy, back with Hometown Commander, back for another episode of Millsy Brews, the show where I take my first pass at the Commander for us on a budget on my quest out brew the magic world. You know the motto, baby. It's ABB, always be brewing, and that's what we're back to do today. The deck list is going to be down in the description for you below, as well as I'd really appreciate if you could interact with the video, like, comment, subscribe, consider checking out those links in the description. I'd appreciate it. Coming over to the Discord, it's been popping lately. I'd love to have you in it. But today, we're hitting another week of Edge of Eternity's content, and today we're talking about a new counters commander in Dyadrine Synthesis Amalgam. Dyadrine is a X green and a white commander, so you're going to get to determine how much you want to put into X when you cast him. But I think Dyadrine adds a really nice thing in that it comes in with a number of counters on it equal to the mana you spent to cast it. This is helpful, right? Because when you start adding commander text to Dyadrine, you're going to get more counters out of it, which I think is really helpful. I think it's what makes it better in some sense, and that it's not just X, but then you got to pay 4, 6, 8, more mana, right? It adds it adds a nice thing to it going back to the cans on, even though your commander, costing 4 or 6 more is never a good thing. But our deck revolves around Dyadrine's second ability. Whenever you attack, you remove a counter from each of 2 creatures we control, and if we do, we draw a card and make a robot creature token. So we're playing Selesnya counters, but I think what we're trying to do is focus on, I guess I would say, more of a go wide counters thought process, right? Dyadrine wants us to make these robot tokens, right? So we want to factor into abilities that allow us to spread counters over all of our creatures and not just making one creature big. And I think we see this with some new cards released in Edge of Eternities and some of the previous sets. So that's where our focus is going to be. But we're going to try to go wide and go tall if we can and have some fun. I want to say a quick thank you to the channel members. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I'm so stoked to see as many of you have. If you're interested in seeing all of our videos for just $1 a month, a little bit early, consider checking it out down below. Well, how do we get counters on all of our creatures? Well, again, the goal is to try to get counters on all of our creatures, not just having one creature goes big. And there's a lot of ways we can look at this. I tried to really hone in on how do we get counters on all of our creatures. We have things like Arwen, Weaver of Hope, that just says each other creature comes in with counters on equal to Arwen's toughness. Well, the bigger Arwen is, the more that comes in. Note each of those robots, right, will get those counters. It doesn't say non-token, it just says each other creature. Mikaeus, right, can remove a counter from it and tap itself to put a counter on each other creature you control. Again, really nice for these robots that are coming in off Dyadrine's ability. But then we kind of get to play double duty with Elspeth, right? Elspeth doubles all the tokens you would make, which is normally a very good effect and something I think we would be able to put to great use in the deck. Same thing with something like Doubling Season, right? Doubling tokens and doubling the amount of counters. But I think the thing that Elspeth does really interestingly for us is she can 0 to put a counter on each creature we control and give them flying until our next turn. 2 things to note about that. 1, the counter goes on them. Great, right? The wider we have, the more counters we're getting. But 2, flying until our next turn is a big deal. You can think about it offensively, but you can also think about it defensively. That does create some really interesting options, and I think she plays really well with both halves of Dyadrine 1 and 2. Same thing with something like Railway Brawler. Whenever another creature comes in, put X counters on it, where X is its power. Those 2 robots are going to come in as 4/4s. Renata's going to have all of those creatures come in with an extra counter on them, so an extra +1/+1. And then using things like the new Ouroboros to just spread counters on all of our creatures. At the start of combat, we put X counters on each creature we control, where X is this creature's power. This is going to really help set up Dyadrine to always have creatures that take counter off, to always give us the robot and always draw us the card. As we're just going to raise the sea level with Ouroboros and making our board harder and harder to deal with. Steel Overseer can tap to give all of our artifact creatures counters. Again, perfect for those robots and Dyadrine, right? Giving them counters. Warden of the Grove says whenever another non-token creature comes in, we endure X, where X is the number of counters on this creature. So, unfortunately, the robot tokens won't get its ability, but everything else will, and can also make us more tokens, more spirit tokens, or just spreading the number of counters. And Warden gets bigger by the turn, giving each and every creature that comes in, more and more counters on it. We have spells like Collective Effort, Fangs of Calonia, Requisition, right? They could just put a counter on each creature we control. Fangs lets us double the amount of counters on them if we pay the overload costs. Requisition lets us add on some removal. Thunderous Velocipede, another way we can spread out counters. Every creature we control comes in with additional counter on if its mana value is 4 or less. That's every robot we're going to have. Otherwise, it's 3 additional counters. This is interesting it's interesting for Dyadrine because it won't ever get the bottom half because the mana value it is going to be 2 on the battlefield, right? No matter what we put into X, so it's going to only ever come in with 1. But this is really helpful to get a counter on all of these robots as they come in. Of course, we're making tokens, so things like Cathar's Crusade makes sense, spreading out tokens when these are counters when these robots come in, right? Paying us back for the 2 counters that we took off to make a robot, because it's going to immediately put a counter on each other creature we control. Virtual Loyalty untaps all of our creatures to put counters on them at the end of turn. And then Felidar Retreat kind of gives us the option to either make more tokens when our lands come in, or spread counters and vigilance when our lands come in, which is a huge deal to be able to take these big attacks with these big creatures and leave them back to block. But I think just like any good counter deck, it's not just about spreading counters, it's about caring about the counters being there. And I think the pretty obvious effects you're going to see in a lot of these counters types decks is these abilities that give creatures ability if they have a counter on them. Battle Priest gives lifelink, Falconer gives flying. These are key combat abilities. It can make or break a game depending on what we have access to, right? You think about it, lifelink gets better and better the bigger our creatures are. You know, every creature being a 9/9 or a 10/10 is a ton of life we're going to gain back our way that make our opponents have a harder time to deal with it. Benevolent Hydra gets to be kind of a hardened scales ability for us, right, affecting the number of counters that go on all our creatures, but it can tap to remove a counter from itself to put a counter on another creature we control if we need to. Dust-Shell Crawler adds trample. Kami of Wizard Hopes adds another one of these hardened scales abilities, but also becomes a mana dork that can tap for mana equal to its power. Bulwark Ox is an odd, probably card to some people to see, but it's a great piece of protection for us. Whenever it attacks while saddled, you can put a counter on a creature, which you may honestly not even need to do as long as you can get counters on all your creatures other ways. Bulwark basically just sacrifices itself to give all of our creatures with counters on them hexproof and indestructible. So here's a protection spell like Heroic Intervention just on a Bulwark Ox that can be saddled, can get counters on itself, can be a threat by itself. But if not, it's just a nice piece, cheap protection that we have access to on our side of the battlefield. Sovereign Akekahau is probably one of my favorite counters matters creatures as far as attacking, because whenever it attacks, each creature you control with a power greater than its base power gets counters equal to the difference. So most of the time, right, in our deck, we're just going to be doubling the amount of counters, right, on all of our creatures, and just making them harder and harder to deal with. Damning Verdict can destroy all creatures with no counters on them. We don't get access to things like, Wave Goodbye and Blue. So this Damning Verdict is probably one of the best single-sided, counters, board wipes are going to get. Inspiring Call draws us a card for each creature, or each creature we have a counter on it, and gives all of our creatures indestructible. So, we have that natural baked-in protection. And then here's more of those classics effects. Hardened Scales is just going to add 1 counter anytime a counter you put on. Branching Evolution and the Earth Crystal put twice the number of counters on instead. Again, abilities that may not look very game changing on a piece of cardboard, but when you start to see them in reality, turning 3 counters into 6, 5 counters into 10, you start to realize how this can really get out of hand, especially when you stack them together and you can choose how you want them to resolve. Innkeeper's Talent has that classic ability to hand out a counter at the start of every combat, but where it really gets good is when you load up to level 2, giving all of our permanents with a counter on them board 1, and then level 3, giving us another copy of that Branching Evolution style ability to double up counters. Sphere Grid says whenever a creature we control hits a player, we put a counter on it. This is a nice way to potentially get some counters on our creatures that don't already have them. And then creatures we control with counters on them just have Reach and Trample. Reach is nice because a lot of our creatures aren't in the air, so this gives us an option to block some of those flying type decks. And Trample, because there is going to come a point in the game where people will just be able to chump block all of our large creatures, and Trample is going to make a difference in the game, and it's going to be very hard for our opponents to deal with these big creatures they can't just chump away and deal with later. And I think the new Terra Symbiosis adds a lot of love to these counters decks, basically getting you some card draws. Remember, you put 1 or more counters on a creature you control, you draw that many cards once per turn. Save it for the biggest amount of counters you're going to put on one of your creatures each turn, draw the cards, and now you're really getting a lot of a value for your 3 mana in a deck that's probably going to be able to put a ton of counters on the things we control. But what I think gets really fun in a deck like this is we care about going wide, and we can do it in a very interesting way. So there's a couple creatures that have a very similar ability. Whenever a counter are put on it, you make a token. Herd Bailiff makes a 4/4 beast. Scurry Oak makes a 1/1 squirrel. We also have Basking Broodskill on the deck that makes a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn that can tap for a colorless mana, or sack for a colorless mana. Well, okay, these are fun abilities. We're going to be able to get extra tokens for them, but can we combo with them? And the answer is yes. So Rosy Cotton has an ability that says whenever you create a token, you put a counter on a creature you control other than Rosy. Well, technically, this isn't an infinite loop, but you can do it as many times as you want, continuing to put counters on a Scurry Oak or a Herd Bailiff or that Basking Broodskill to just make a ton of tokens. Now, there's a lot of ways you could think about how you could do this. I think most ideally you'd want to do it on somebody else's turn if possible to make a bunch of tokens and have them hasty and be ready. But, I mean, you could also find a way to do this in the middle of combat, potentially. This could be done in a lot of ways, but I think the interesting thing here is that all these creatures are great on their own. You know, if we're using abilities like Machias or Ouroboros, or all these abilities that just hand out a single counter, you know, each couple counters each turn, well, they're just going to widen our board, right, making us these tokens. But if we can kind of bring them together with Rosy Cotton, we can make an infinitely large Scurry Oak or Herd Bailiff, also with a ton of tokens that can take over a board and become a real threat, right, for our opponents. Also, if we can add in those other abilities to give them tokens when they come in, now we just have a large board that all has tokens on them. But I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. No deck's ever complete. This is my first shot at Dyadrine, and I think going into testing, I think the answer for me is, do we have enough ways to put counters on things? And are we going wide enough is probably the two questions I have. So as far as going wide enough, you have another combo engine that we can potentially use, an animation module. It says whenever one or more counters are put on a permanent we control, plus counters, we can pay one. If we do, we make a servo. So we can make another creature. It is an artifact creature. Again, pays off that Seal Overseer, go wider, that kind of thing. I also thought about like Thousand Moon Smithy, right? Making these gnome soldiers, they get bigger for each artifact and creature we control, and you can flip the Smithy over into a land that can make you more of these gnome soldiers. Again, I love that idea, but I kind of wanted to make sure we anchor our deck in the counters and making sure we're doing our counters game well before we overcommit into going too wide, because I feel like going too wide is going to be a problem if we don't find the things that put counters on all of our things. But I also looked at something like patrolling Peacemaker, you know, profiting from our opponents committing crimes, something that's very common in Commander, targeting other people's things or targeting an opponent, and proliferates when it does, putting counters on all of our things. I like the Peacemaker. I think it's a really good card and probably deserves to come in. But I think we needed to kind of, and this is the biggest thing I talk about in Millsy Brews all the time, this is what these episodes are about, is we need somewhere to start. We need a list to start with so that we can put this through the ringer, you know, put this through our paces and figure out what we need to round out our deck. Because no first deck you ever build is going to be perfect on paper, nor do I believe this one is. And so kind of keeping these things in mind as we go into testing is what, you know, we are here to do. But let's do what we love to do on the channel the most and get into our playtest. Remember, the goal of playtests on our channel is not to find magical Christmas land. It's not just to show off all our best plays, but it's to get in some gameplay scenarios and kind of understand what we're looking for in a hand and how we're going to kind of set up our game plan. Kind of light on lands here as a two-laner, but we got Shalinda, which is an interesting counter outlet. We've got Basking Broodskill, one of those creatures that makes tokens when counters go on it. Battle Priest for lifelink, Inspiring Call for card draw, and Collective Effort put a counter everything. This is pretty much golden with like one or two more lands. And I think I'm willing to risk it. We've got a good amount of lands. We've got a good lot of ramp. And Broodscale can help us by ramping. When they get a counter on it each turn, you make a creature you can sack for colorless mana. Okay, well, we fixed part of our problem there on turn one with the drawing a land. I mean, Shalinda, I feel like doesn't feel like a bad turn to play. I don't really see anything else being better. Shalinda says whenever another creature comes in, you put a counter on that creature if its power is less than Shalinda's power. Otherwise, Shalinda gets a counter. So Shalinda is a lifelinker that can start growing. So there's doubling season. Again, doubles of the tokens that Dyadrine makes and the counters that we put on our things. I don't mind the brood scale. We could Dyadrine for one, which is always an option. It would put another counter on Shalinda, and we could go from there. I guess the question is, what would we do next turn? And I guess the answer there is, I guess something like the Collective Effort. The question I think comes to the back of my mind for this deck is, when do you put Dyadrine out? Do you put it out as soon as you think it's relevant? Put him out as a spend 3 mana to put him out as a 3/4 this turn, and Shalinda gets a counter, and we have 2/3 power creatures, or do we set up with something like the Brute Scale, try to get a counter on it next turn and go from there. I think I'm apt to put the Dyadrine in just because I think it will lead to more card draw next turn, potentially, right? It attacks next turn, gets some card draw. It also has baked in trample, but I think I like this idea a little bit more. And if we hit more lands, then we can look into something like Battle Priest, right, for some lifelink. Attack with the Shalinda, obviously. So we did get the land. So now the line is either Battle Priest or the Effort. I think the Battle Priest makes the most sense because I think it leads to the best line. It comes in, putting the counter on Shalinda. So now removing a counter from Shalinda and Dyadrine isn't going to lose the lifelink from the Battle Priest. And I think that's exactly what I do. Try to find a nice attack where Dyadrine can get in and get safe. I think it's probably possible on turn 4. Make the robot, draw a card. And now we're kind of getting right along our way. We open up a fun possibility with Cathar's Crusade. Like I said, taking the counters off to make a robot with Cathar's Crusade is always going to put enough counters back on. But unfortunately, we didn't hit it. We didn't hit the opportunity to give all the value right for that. So I guess the question becomes: do you go for something like Collective Effort just to spread a few more counters around, make a better chance of getting some more counters onto our team that way? Do we go for something like the Earth Crystal and try to go for it next turn? You also could have something like Doubling Season next turn after you play the Earth Crystal, right? Since it reduces our green spells by 1. I think there's a lot of lines here. I kind of like the Earth Crystal. Again, I there's probably an argument for attacking and making the robot. Sorry, the robot would have gotten the counter from Shalinda, right? Because its power would have been less than Shalinda's. Because what we could do here is, remember, the counters that get put on get doubled. So we could take a counter off Shalinda and the robot to make another robot and draw, which doesn't seem like a bad thing to me. Just to try to, get that when the robot comes in, it doesn't have more than Shalinda, so it'll actually get 2, right? And that's pretty great. And there's our land, right, that we were hoping to still see. Not much we can do with it this turn except play the Brood Scale, but it at least will show us that. This actually leads into a fun one. So the Brood Scale will get a counter, which will make us a spawn. It'll get 2 counters, which the spawn will then get 2 counters, right? So that's kind of nice. We're building up our board. And then now as we come back into our next turn, all of our green spells cost 1 less. I would love to reduce this Cathar's Crusade, but I still feel like Cathar's Crusade's the pick here. It could get me, 2 more counters overall? Because when I take the counters off of Dyadrine to make a robot, that's going to trigger making us 1 more counter across the board. And then when that counter goes on Brood Scale, no, I would set up an infinite loop, wouldn't I? Because Brood Scale is going to always get a counter when a creature comes in off Cathar's Crusade. Okay, so we've got a slight problem. We can't just slam a Cathar's Crusade. Otherwise, we start a loop we can't stop, right? Because we can't stop the Brood Scale from continuing to target, to go off. So, all right, we can't do that line because then we create an infinite loop we can't stop. So I think what makes the most sense to me would be Doubling Season. Now our counters are getting quadrupled. Or is it Railway Brawler? Railway Brawler here is 4 mana. I've still got 2 mana up for the Inspiring Call, is my thought. But I'm still getting some creatures in. Go to combat. Oh, sorry, that comes in, and Shalinda gets 2 counters, right? Because its power is more than Shalinda. And then my thought is counter from the spawn, counter from the Brood Scale to make a robot. Robot comes in with 4 counters, right? 2 what would have been brawlers, but we're going to set it to 4. And then I did it this way so that Shalinda would get 2 more. And then, we're looking pretty great there. Right now we're spreading counters around, and that, would have drawn us a card as well. And then if we wanted to, maybe on an opponent's turn before our turn, we could crack that Inspiring Call. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards drawn. Doesn't feel terrible, especially coming into our turn. I mean, let's just see, what would that do? Would it do anything? There's Herd Bailiff. Again, I didn't think about Cathar's Crusade with these creatures. That's actually kind of dangerous and something we need to think about at the end of the day. Because it's not a May. Oh my gosh, Brute Scale's a May. Oh, I missed that. I thought it was a for sure like Herd Bailiff. Herd Bailiff is a May. What am I doing? All right, well, I just put an F in the chat. I absolutely just ruined that one. I should have just gone Cathar's Crusade. And then you can run that combo as much as you want to. Just make a ton of spawns, right? Just grow your board infinitely. Maybe Dyadrine just nails somebody with Commander. Jeez, I can't believe it. For my head, I thought it was an infinite combo in my head, and it's a May. All right, well, let's go to playtest number 2 because we clearly binned to that one. But it goes why you need to read your cards and do these playtests so you understand your lines. Dyadrine should have been able to knock somebody out with commander damage, right? We would have had all those spawns, basically a bunch of mana, and we would have held up the Inspiring Call to protect the board. Everything would have had counters on it, meaning the whole board was safe underneath the Inspiring Call. If somebody did find a way to destroy all our creatures around the Inspiring Call, you just Inspire Call, draw an arbitrarily large amount of cards. Maybe that's a reason to not go too deep on the Cathar's Crusade, right? So that you wouldn't just draw your entire library with Inspiring Call. But, some machinations in the back of our head here on playtest number 2. We're keeping a 3-lander with Champion of Lamhole. A card I expect to see play in a lot of counter decks. Creatures with power less than it can't block creatures we control. Again, great when we're trying to go wide with these tokens, stopping our opponents from blocking us. Gyre Sage grows. With Evolve on the counters on it, taps for mana. There's Benevolent Hydra. Got the Requisition Aid. I like this one. It's got a good start to a hand. I think we can find some things to make it a teeny bit better, but I think it's just Gyre Sage. Love seeing the Terra Symbiosis. That's going to help on drawing. My thought is Lambholt. Now, Lambholt won't trigger Gyre Sage, but that's okay because I think we're still wanting to come towards this. So what makes the most sense here? Benevolent Hydra for 2 or Dyadrine for 2? Either way, Champion Lambholt's getting a counter. It would get 2 from the Hydra, and the Hydra would actually put 2 on Gyre Sage. So that actually doesn't seem like a bad call, right? Because this will come in with 2 counters on it. Because it's only put on another creature. Champion sees it coming in, gets 2 counters. Gyre Sage sees it coming in, getting 2 counters. And now Gyre Sage can tap for 2 mana. Would it see the Evolve? Oh, that's the Evolve, sorry. I was going to say, now it's only 2 mana, but we're still getting close to it being really worth it, right? It could be pretty good on the next turn. Champion can take probably a free attack here on turn 4. I doubt anybody's got anything that high up to silence it. Okay, well, now we have options. We have Virtue of Loyalty, which could start spreading counters around, make our creatures even tougher to deal with. We could 2, 3, 5, 6. We could go into Dyadrine for 4. It would get more counters on Gyre Sage. It'd get more counters on Champion of Lambholt. That doesn't seem like a terrible idea either. Like I said, we could get the Virtue in if we want to, and just get some more growth. But I kind of like the Dyadrine for 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 6 from the Gyre Sage. So it's going to come in with 4 counters on it, although it's going to, Benevolent Hydra, right, is going to give it 5. 2 from it coming in off of the Champion of Lambholt, 2 for Gyre Sage, right, having a creature with a higher power than it come in. So now we're in good shape, right? Anything with 5 power, less than, it'd have to be 5 power or greater to block us, so these 2 got some nice attacks if we want them. Remember, Dyadrine's ability is on anything attacking, not it attacking. So I think we can pretty clearly take 1 off of it. And I guess Gyre Sage at this point and make a robot and draw a card. I think we're getting to the upper limit of what we need. Right, Gyre Sage, we can play that land. So then as we come into this turn, now we got 6 mana and then 9 total from Gyre Sage. I like the idea of Terra Symbiosis. I'm just not entirely sure if we can get more than 1 draw of a card this turn. Sorry, Lamholt gets 2 more when that robot comes in last turn. Go Requisition Raid, get the. So my thought is if we go like Terra Symbiosis plus Requisition Raid, this is going to put 2 counters because of Benevolent Hydra, drawing us 2 cards. That could be an option. We could slam in the Virtual Loyalty, which still leads to 2 counters. It just does it at the end of turn. I've got 3 6 mana. I still like the Virtue to untap them all. I still feel like it makes the most sense. Now, I could remove a counter from Benevolent Hydra to put counters elsewhere if I wanted to. Like, I guess technically I could have done that, put the counters on Gyre Sage. And then I think that would have been, what, 5 mana? Plus 6, 7, we could have got the Knight and the Virtual Loyalty. Now that I think about it, I think that makes more sense. Because then the Knight's going to trigger, right, Champion, and that's going to draw us 2. All right, we're going to draw 2 pretty much no matter what. Now everything's unblockable, right? Take a counter off the Champion. I guess take a counter off Gyre Sage. Get a robot, draw a card, put a couple more counters back on Champion. Take our attacks. I mean, Dyadrine's getting bigger, right? End of turn, everything gets 2 counters, right? Because of Benevolent Hydra putting an extra counter on. And now we're looking great, right? We've got this engine kind of set up. Something like Garruk's Uprising is going to start spreading trample across the board, which feels really good. My thought is do that. That draws us a card since we have a creature with power 4 or greater. Oh, man, Cathar's Crusade just feels great here, right? You're making at least the robot if we don't have any other way to get another creature in this turn. Because that's 3, so 6, 7, 8, 9 mana right now. You could go Crystal Cathar's Crusade. You give up, tapping up the Gyre Sage. Right, everybody attacks. You take a counter off of Champion, take a damage off of Gyre. Make the robot. The robot coming in is going to try to put 1 counter and everything. We'll add the 1 from Benevolent to make it 2, and then double it to 4 with Earth Crystal. That's pretty great. And then now, because that's swing off, I mean, now Dyadrine's getting bigger, this is getting bigger. Nothing can be blocked because Lamholt's just massive. That draws us 4, right? And I think we're just in good shape on this playtest. We're starting to see, right, these synergies really come through. Let's get into playtest number 3 here. I think we really got to see the line come together on that one. 3-lander here with Incubation Druid, a great mana dork that gets better if you get a counter on it. We see Gyre Sage again. There's Mikaeus, can really spread those counters around, and then Terra Symbiosis. So I like this one. I think this is a great start. Hardened Scales. We could go Gyre Sage into the Falconer if we wanted to get a counter on it, right? That doesn't seem like a terrible idea. Falconer, get a counter on it, which actually gets 2 counters, right? And that's before it can tap. So now it can tap for 2 for the Incubation Druid, right? So now we're setting up a good amount that turn, right? Now coming into this turn, I've got 4, 6, 7 mana. Unless I can get a counter on Druid somehow. I go Dyadrine for 5. I'm getting a couple more counters on Gyre Sage. But that's really it. If I can get the Mikaeus in this turn, next turn, right, it can start spreading counters. If I go, I've got 7 mana. I could go 2 here and 3 here just to get some counters in. So 2 in on the Benevolent Hydra. Comes in with 3. That would trigger Gyre Sage to get a couple counters. And then Mikaeus for 2, which will come in as 4 because of Benevolent Hydra and Hardened Scales. But again, now the point there is that Mikaeus can tap next turn, right, to start spreading our counters around. And now we're in great shape. Whether we do that, I was going to say, or we go for Dyadrine. But seeing Cathar's Crusades, I think, even more helpful. But I think what we want to do is tap Mikaeus first, take a counter off of it, and it puts 2 counters on each other creature we control. 1 from its 1 ability, 1 from Benevolent, and then 1 from Hardened Scale. So 3 counters. So now Gyre Sage is tapping for even more. So that's 7 from the Gyre Sage, 8, 9, 10, 11. 7 from Gyre Sage, 3 from the Druids, that's 10. And then, so this is 14 mana. We go Cathar for 5, Terra Symbiosis for 3, so that's 8. And then I said we had 14, so we go Dyadrine for 4 into the X. Again, it's going to come in with an extra because of the Benevolent, and then an extra because of the Hardened Scales, so it comes in with 6, and this is going to be the one we're going to... Sorry, it'll be 7, because we can, well, 7, 8. Because when it comes in, Cathar's Crusade's going to go off, getting 2 more counters and everything, right? 3, sorry, because of the Hardened Scale, or because of the Benevolence. So now you can start to see where this plan's really coming together. So even more than that. No. Sorry. The Terra Symbiosis is just counters put on it once, which would be the original 6, right? Put on Dyadrine when it comes in. 4. No, it would be 8 because it's 6 is the cost of what we're paying. 7, 8. Okay, sorry. So it's 8 there, and then 2 more because of the Cathar's Crusade. Okay, but now the point is, now you have a completely wide board. Cathar's Crusade is going to help us out when we inevitably attack this turn, take a count off literally anything, make a robot and spread them all again. They're all in the air because of the Falconer, although we did tap our mana dorks. I don't think we really care. Benevolence in the air, Falconer's in the air. And I think we're in absolutely great shape. We don't have any free protection, which is kind of a bummer. But I think we're still in good shape. If somebody wipes the board, it would definitely suck. But I feel like that's going to be our weakness, right, as a deck. But otherwise, we just untap it. I think, gosh, our opponents are just in trouble. If we make the robot, I think we just what? You could take one here. You can take one here because these matter a little bit less than all the rest of them. Robot, draw a card. 1, 2, 3. Right. I've got to pitch to hand size. I want to keep Renata for the devotion, but I don't know if that really matters. I mean, we come back to our next turn. Damning Verdict probably just wipes the way for the board. And then, you could throw something like a Johnny down to give them Vigilance. You could hold up something like Duty Beyond Death to give them Indestructible. We could Fangs and just double the number of counters on them because we got 13, 14, 15, 17, 20 mana. So, I mean, we could Damning, Fangs to double them up and still leave up protection. And again, we're still going to take the counters off. We're still going to make the robot. They're still going to get bigger. And I think we're just in great shape. But I'd love to know, what do you think of Dyadrine down in the comment section below? Really interesting deck. I think Dyadrine's intriguing for sure. It definitely, you're using it, do this creature ETBs, these things. But as we could see, it's useful. You still want to go wide. You're paid off for going wide. We just didn't see much more going wide than his ability. But I mean, when you start to see things like Cathar's Crusade or, those, whenever a creature comes in, everything gets a counter's abilities, I think you can start to see where it's going to pay off for you. But I'd love to know what you think of Dyadrine down in the comment section below, and I will catch you on the next.